Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 5. This week, we're talking about sound and image. We're looking at movies and TV. In order for us to go chronologically, film precedes television, so we're going to start with chapter 7. This is our third week of having multiple chapters in a week, and it should be our last one for the semester. And it'll be the end of our history period. So from this point on, we're going to leave the media history and move into more contemporary issues. There will always be some elements of history in all of our chapters, but things will get more contemporary moving forward. You guys are doing a great job. I know I'm still backed up on grading, so bear with me, and I should get us all caught up by the end of this week. I just wanted to let you guys know that usually around week 6, I will typically send you guys a progress email to let you know how you're doing. It's helpful if you submit one of your writing assignments before that time period, but if you feel like you're stressed in this first half of the semester and you can't really get to it, that's okay. Try not to let it go too long after we start the second half of the semester before you turn in one of your writing options so that I can see how you're handling it and give you the time to redo one and take some lessons from feedback for your second one. All right, let's get into our chapter. In this chapter, we're going to look first at early technology and the evolution of film as a form of mass media, including silent films and the emergence of the Hollywood studio system, and the 3 levels of film, so production, distribution, and exhibition, dictate how the industry works. We'll consider the arrival of sound and the power of storytelling, and look at the movie business today, its major players, the economic clout, technological advances, and implications for democracy, and how convergence has changed the way the industry distributes movies and the way we experience them. Okay, so let's start by talking about some important technological developments and key figures in this process. Our book tells us that the concept of film goes as far back as Leonardo da Vinci, who theorized in the 15th century about creating a device that would reproduce reality. As early as the 17th century, we have the magic lantern, which projected images painted onto glass using an oil lamp as a light source. These are hand-created images as opposed to photographs. They are not representations of reality in the sense that we think of film. Then 200 years later, with the evolution and the development of photography, we have the beginning of moving images. These are happening primarily through the thaumatrope or the zoetrope, are scan systems. In other words, what you have is a series of images with a restricted light source that moves and creates the illusion of movement, and a series of images that you're looking at pass by a limited light source quickly, right? So you've had at one point projection, and you've now had this rapid succession of photographs that create the sensation of movement, but we've yet to see the combination of projection so that many people can experience something at once, because all of these scopes are really small and individual. So we haven't yet seen this projection aspect combined with the reality aspect of photography. And this doesn't really happen until Muybridge, who was the first to project the moving picture in 1878. George Eastman then later developed the first roll of film in 1884, and this allows for film to be produced far less cumbersomely. Improving on that even further, Hannibal Goodwin created a roll of film using celluloid, which is how we still think of film, as opposed to digital. It's a sort of plasticky substance which allowed light to move through the pictures. This also enabled a strip of film to move way more quickly through the camera itself, and so it could be photographed more quickly. So the illusion of movement got more sophisticated. Rather than having larger spaces in between each image in a succession, there would be less gaps. As you've seen on your own cell phones now, when you take a live photo, it's actually a rapid series of succession of images as opposed to film, but it'll appear when you look at it as a small snippet of video, when in fact it's actually a set of stills. So in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison attempted to invent something that could bring words and pictures together. If we remember Thomas Edison, he was important to our week on sound and thinking about telephony, telegraphy, and one-to-one communication. He wasn't successful in bringing sound into film, and it would actually be a significant amount of time before that technology aligned properly. But he did end up developing many other foundational technologies for early movies, and these included the kinetograph, an early movie camera, the kinetoscope, a single-person viewing system, and the vitascope, which you can see is the backdrop for this timeline I've created here. This was an early large-screen projection system that would lay the groundwork for the idea of film as something that was watched collectively. As you see here, this is a representation of an old-fashioned theater with a film being projected inside of a painting frame on the stage. Finally, the Lumiere brothers invented the cinematic glass, which combined camera film and the projection system. And this allowed for many people at once to view moving images. They debuted their invention in France in 1895, showing short films for a small fee. It's important to remember that these are not movies the way that we think of them. They were incredibly brief, but this moment still acted as an important first version of the modern movie theater and the introduction of film as mass media. The mass media stage was realized not just through these technological inventions in film, but also through the introduction of narrative. The novelty of seeing images moving quickly wore off pretty quickly for most audiences. So to become a mass medium, early films had to offer what other media like books achieved at this point. The suspension of disbelief, the ability to tell a story and bring a viewer into that story. They had to create narrative worlds that engaged an audience's imagination. So early films like The Vanishing Lady and The Great Train Robbery were groundbreaking in their use of narrative within film. This was important because at this time, films were still silent. If you've ever seen a silent film, that means a series of film events happening on screen would then be broken by usually a black background with white text that would say what people were saying. So that was how you got dialogue, which they tried to keep quite limited so it didn't interrupt the film too much. Then live music would have been played simultaneously, usually by a piano player. Nickelodeons were an early form of movie theater important for popularizing the movie theater experience as a source of entertainment. The name combines the admission price of a nickel with the Greek word for theater. Often Nickelodeons were put in converted storefronts. They were made accessible because of a low cost, so it was quite inexpensive to go. And they transcended language barriers because all these films were silent and had very few textual interruptions. You could get a sense of what it was you were watching if you didn't speak the written language that was on the text pages, or if you couldn't read. These kinds of movie theaters peaked around 1910 and were soon replaced by theaters driven by the then forming Hollywood studio system. So by the 1910s, movies are already starting to become a major industry. In the 1910s, a group was formed of US and French film producers that wanted to control film technology as a way to control the movie industry. But many independent movie producers didn't agree with this, and eventually many relocated to Southern California to create a new hub for independent movie producers. So if we think about it, the history of Hollywood was actually people who were trying to escape the formalization of the industry in other ways, which becomes quite ironic later for us. California provided a context that had less expensive labor, a mild climate, so you could shoot year round, diverse geography, which allowed for the production of many different kinds of stories, and made it ideal for movie producing. It also put them far away from Edison's Trust, which was located in New Jersey. Edison's Trust is that cartel of major US and French producers. So we almost had Hollywood in New Jersey. Their actions could go largely unchecked by these major figures in film. Adolph Zucker, who founded Paramount Pictures, and later William Fox, who founded what would eventually become 20th Century Fox, were key figures in helping break up Edison's Trust on behalf of other independent movie producers in Hollywood. By finding loopholes in the trust controls and eventually by suing Edison's Trust to break apart the control previously held by the trust, shifted into the hands of the Hollywood studios, right? So they kind of become the controlling cartel that they've just broken up. And they would go on to develop their own strategies for controlling the movie industry incredibly tightly. So one way that these new Hollywood studio structures solidify their control is by creating what's referred to as a studio system. In a studio system, the three essential levels of the film industry are all under the control of a single studio. The production, distribution, and exhibition of a film are all managed, controlled, and profited by one studio. This strategy is known more broadly as vertical integration in business. So vertical integration is when levels of a business are integrated into one company. Vertical integration provides more control and also more profits for businesses because they control every single step of the process, in this case, the movie industry. The downside, though, is that only a few companies then have control over the movie industry. So there are few places for innovation or change to occur. And it also becomes something that we've referred to before as the oligopoly. The oligopoly is, in the movie industry, a market form wherein a market or industry is dominated by a very small number of large sellers. So there's very minimal competition. The monopoly is then a related term and is the extreme version. In a monopoly, you literally have only one, mono meaning one. In an oligopoly, it's a very small group, but has a similar sort of effect. So things like vertical integration or horizontal integration, another process of consolidating business activities, often lead to industries becoming oligopolies and monopolies. So while being in a business in a monopolistic or oligopistic industry is great for business profits, it's not great for audiences or consumers, and also for producers inside these spaces like actors and other workers. It means that very few people control what the rest of us have access to. In the case of movies, it means that there are a small number of companies deciding what we get to watch and what we see represented in films, and what kinds of stories get told. It also means that the kinds of movies that get made are those that are the most profitable, that maybe not those that are the most important to society, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But quickly, I just want to go through the phases of the system. So production being the first, in the early Hollywood system, the studio system was part of a great amount of control around creative talent. Everything that goes into production includes, in the early days, actors were largely anonymous. They were there just to be bodies moving on screen and as narrative developed to push a plot point further, but they weren't celebrities. There wasn't a focus on fame. Actors didn't make a lot of money. They were just hired by a studio to fit into different roles in films the studio produced. However, some early pioneering actors like Mary Pickford, who unfortunately I didn't put an image of here, but you should look her up. She's an amazing figure, is the name of one such actor who convinced studios that actors could be more valuable as stars and celebrities, which elevated the status of actors and eventually ended up earning them better compensation in the industry. So while actors did successfully make some headway in this time, the studio system still dominated by keeping all workers, including actors, under exclusive studio contracts, which reinforced the studio's control over talent in the industry. So Marilyn Monroe or Lauren Bacall or any of the women that you see here would have been held under very tight contracts and only been allowed to produce the films that that studio was making, and only the ones that they wanted them in. So they had very little choice, and therefore also couldn't compete for higher salaries by going to other producers. The next phase, of course, is distribution. And distribution is where we see films making their way into places where they might be accessed. So this is not the exhibition process, right? So this is sort of the in-between of getting a film. Once it's been produced, you have to make sure that it can appear in a market before it's even going to show up in a movie theater. Our book goes into this in more detail, but one of the important things that happened in this moment was block booking, the distribution strategy where exhibitors had to rent marginal films to get films with big stars. There was a negotiation process because of the studio system. The phase that we'll all be the most familiar with will be the exhibition phase of the film. Exhibition is the process by which we actually get to see these films in movie theaters. The big five studios, MGM, Paramount, RKO, 20th Century Fox, and Warner Brothers, owned their own film exhibiting theaters as well as the production and distribution facilities. They distributed their own films to a network of studio-owned theaters, mostly in urban areas, and charged higher ticket prices. They had vertically integrated their studio system all the way through to exhibition. The little three, so that would be Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, they were called the little three because each of these studios lacked one of the key elements required in the vertical integration system. Universal and Columbia came the closest at reaching full integration, but the problem was that neither Columbia nor Universal owned enough theater circuits. United Artists, on the other hand, which, by the way, was owned by Mary Pickford, never reached full integration because the studio was regarded as a back distributor, loaning their money to independent producers and releasing their films, rather than having a system of production inside. It was a different model because it was created by people who had different experiences as workers inside of the system. We can't talk about the history of film without talking about the history of a film called Birth of a Nation. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the plot of this film. Trigger warning if you do decide to do this as your documentary. Birth of a Movement is about the reaction to this film, but it does include a number of clips. I chose not to even reproduce images from it here because it includes blackface and comedic representations of Ku Klux Klan attacks on Black men. It is extremely upsetting, extremely racist film. The story of which is set in the Reformation era South after the Civil War. A wealthy white family is attacked by a group of recently freed and formerly enslaved Black men who threaten to harm them, particularly the young daughter of the family. And the Ku Klux Klan rides into town and saves the family, right? So this is an extremely problematic film that produces the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic entity and protector of the South. Our book addresses this controversial film pretty briefly. It was created in 1915 by a man named D.W. Griffith, who had made several other films. While it is regularly referred to as the first feature-length film, it is not the first feature-length film. This is largely a justification, I think, of the fact that we continue to teach it. And maybe what we want to talk about is what it was at first that is more upsetting, which is that it was the first blockbuster. So the first feature-length films there was one in Australia in 1906 called The Story of the Kelly Gang. One of Griffith's own films, Judith of Bethulia, released in 1914, the year before, was also a feature-length film. And 1914 also saw a film called His Majesty the Scarecrow of Oz, produced by Frank L. Baum, the writer of The Wizard of Oz. So it was definitely not the first feature-length film. All of these were over 70 minutes, which was the marker of a feature-length film. And while Birth of a Nation was significantly longer, it's 3 hours, what it really was the first blockbuster. A blockbuster being a film that was not only extremely expensive to produce, but that ended up being exhibited incredibly widely and seen by many people. So it was one of the most widely exhibited films of its time, including a screening in the White House to the celebration of then President Woodrow Wilson. It set up this trend of blockbuster films and a lot of narrative tropes that end up being reproduced. So films like Ben-Hur that came after, The Ten Commandments, also all were these large, expensive affairs to create with big, wide scenes of fights and battles that then gets turned into an epic story presented in the film. Birth of a Nation is extremely racist and was protested at the time of its initial release, at its 1925 re-release, and again in the 40s when it was shown again. Each time, people pointed out that it was celebrating the Ku Klux Klan. It's based on a book called The Klansman, and it glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. It perpetuates a number of stereotypes about Black Americans. It reappeared at moments in popular culture when it seemed Black Americans were getting closer to having more rights. So every time that happens, the film gets reintroduced to the public, and there was a sort of revivification of the Klan in those moments. So many of the foundational movies in U.S. media history, not just Birth of a Nation, are also incredibly racist, sexist, homophobic, and held other ideologies that influenced this media and system that have been built around it. We'll talk more about this when we get to the section on cultural imperialism. But the takeaway is that it's important to recognize that these ideologies work in ways that are systemic in media. So even if today many people don't share the values that are produced in a film like Birth of a Nation, the systems that were set up as a result of this film are still in use today. The kinds of stories that get told and the kinds of characters that are being produced, these things still influence the way that we tell stories now. And those people that created the system that is still in use and those ideologies that came with it are still very present and prevalent in the movie industry. So eventually people started trying to add sound to film. So all of these movies we've been talking about, including Birth of a Nation, were still silent films. Attempts to bring sound into film in the early days were really unsuccessful, often because it would sort of run in between in spurts as opposed to consistently. Movie tone film reels were the first film footage that included sound that was actually alongside the images on the film, so it could be played simultaneously. News was a major innovator for bringing sound into movie theaters, which was where most people saw their news. If we think about this time frame, we're having the expansion of radio. People are listening to the news at home, and major events are also being represented in short newsreels at the beginning of movies when people would go see them. And this was how you saw the news as opposed to heard it. This was an incredibly volatile time in filmmaking. There were not yet what we would refer to as decency codes. So a lot of things that we would think of as not something that we would expect to see in a movie theater were allowed to happen in movies early on. So nudity, all kinds of things that later would be banned. In the 1920s and early 30s, there was a kind of wild heyday. It wasn't until the 1940s or 1950s that we start to see restriction against these things. An interesting moment in the history of film was in 1947, the Hollywood 10 hearings. So many actors and other movie industry workers in Hollywood were investigated following World War II, supposedly for having communist ties. This was all part of the McCarthy movement at the time in U.S. politics. Senator McCarthy went after a number of largely creative producers in the United States. These were also people who had been playwrights that had been sponsored by the WPA. This became a space to try to attack anyone he thought was un-American. Communism was a really good way to frame a lot of things as un-American, even if they weren't necessarily communist. There were 10 hearings, 9 screenwriters and 1 producer who were suspected of having communist ties and were asked to identify other communist sympathizers in Hollywood to get out of things. They all refused, were charged with contempt, and ended up in prison. And when they were released, unfortunately, many major studios had to blacklist them to keep suspicion off of themselves. Many of these accusations were, of course, unfounded and hugely unconstitutional because someone's political affiliations is a private matter in the United States. Also, it's important to point out, and we can talk about this more later in another week, we also see that a lot of the people who were brought up on charges for un-American activities were also civil rights organizers. They expressed sympathy for or actually aided in civil rights movements. Some of them were homosexuals. A number of different things could get someone listed as that's un-American in McCarthy's eyes. At this same period, we're also seeing a major shift in film as television becomes much more popularized in the home. By the 1950s, this spurred changes in the movie industry. And it responded by developing more content oriented towards more serious matters and content that explored larger social problems, as well as really big, glamorous films, things that couldn't be produced on television. So they were trying to differentiate their product from what could be produced for television. They also introduced new technologies that TVs couldn't replicate at the time, like 3D and panorama in the 60s, and even some in the late 50s. Trying to adopt the viewing experience and make it profitable and desirable for consumers to want to leave their homes to go to the movies. Another influential moment happened between Hollywood and the U.S. government, known as the Paramount decision. This court case tried to break up all of the oligopolistic structures of Hollywood, and the Supreme Court ruled that the studios needed to divest themselves of theaters, which meant that they would not be as vertically integrated as they had been previously. Studios could no longer own movie theaters that their movies would end up playing in, and this created opportunities for new types of exhibition in different types of theaters. This is the birth of what we refer to as art house theaters, and also drive-ins come into popularity at this time, which were often run by local mom and pops, but it really changed the way that films existed in popular culture. The Paramount decision was meant to increase competition, but it never really changed much about the structure of the Hollywood film industry in relationship between production and distribution, because Hollywood retained its hold on these two aspects. And this still kind of persists even now. If we think about what's happening at this moment, we have media companies that also own cable outlets, that also own streaming services. So where vertical integration has gotten even more intense. Another development was the introduction of cable and video cassettes in the 1970s. This brought movies from the studios into people's homes and ended up being a huge financial benefit for the movie industry, as they could compete in the home with television content, not just in the theater, so they didn't have to entice people to come out. The development of megaplexes in the 1990s also created different exhibition experiences and opportunities for the movie industry and for moviegoers, because they were an additional technologically advanced viewing experience that couldn't be mirrored inside the home. So then as digital becomes an opportunity for home viewing, digital options begin to appear. This becomes an even more ideal space for people to watch films. And we start seeing things like direct release to streaming services and means of being able to adjust to the digital environment. Traditionally, there have been 6 major studio players known as the Big Six: Warner Brothers, Paramount, 21st Century Fox, Universal, Columbia Pictures, and Disney. And these studios traditionally accounted for more than 80 to 86% of the commercial film revenue. and began diversifying in the 1980s due to a series of corporate mergers. And so this meant that they gained other companies that have additional functions under their umbrellas. So things like television and other media, as well as digital platforms and other industries. Today, movie studios have about 6 major sources of income: box office receipts, DVD sales, rentals and downloads, pay-per-view and premium cable, foreign markets, distributing indie films, and licensing and product placement, which we'll talk more about when we get into our week on advertising. With the digital turn, the movie industry has quickly embraced internet distribution through online providers like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Google, and increasingly movies have been made available on smartphones and tablets. 2012 was the first year that digital sales outpaced the sales of physical DVDs, and that trend has continued over the past 8 years. The internet has also become essential for marketing, as they can reach more audiences through the medium. Digital platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon have also started to present huge challenges to traditional studios, as they now create their own content that competes directly with studio content on their platforms. So while the internet provided a lot of opportunities for traditional studios, it has, especially in the last 10 years, started to present some new direct challenges. The podcast I've shared with you all for this week addresses this directly, thinking about how through its cheap licensing of films to Netflix in the early days, film studios have trained audiences to go to Netflix first. Now Netflix has become a major content producer. They've created their own competition in many ways. A little bit more on consolidation. This map is amazing and is widely available on the internet and shows you all of the different aspects that Disney owns of our media world. Everything from theaters to different franchises, different television stations. And this is also covered in the documentary I've shared with you all for this week on the Mickey Mouse Monopoly. That film also touches on cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is a way that countries are attracted, pressured, forced, and sometimes bribed into shaping social institutions to correspond to, or even to promote the values and structures of the dominating center of the system. So in American imperialism, that center is U.S. values and structures. This can be either a formal policy or happen subtly, as with the spread of outside influences such as television, movies, and other kinds of cultural products. So what this might mean in practice is that if you grow up outside of the United States, you might see more representations of your culture through the lens of the United States and its perceptions than through your own communities. This has lasting effects and can be really problematic. It's also really deceptive and unidirectional. It's quite common for children all over the world to see American media. However, the United States is the third highest producer of films in the world, not the first. The first is India, followed immediately by Nigeria. These two countries make far more films than we do. While most people in India and Nigeria will have seen an American film, many Americans will have not seen an Indian or Nigerian film. This is starting to change, of course, with access to many different channels on Netflix and digital and satellite television over the last decades has really broadened. However, based on the control of distribution and the control of exhibition that still happens primarily from US owned companies, there's still a limited point of access, right? And so, yes, we have this massive global cinema. Other countries have rich histories of producing successful films, not only Nigeria and India, but also historically. I have included an image from a really cool website called Classicy, which shows films from the Caucasus and Central Asia. A lot of them are historic. These were also important developments in film. Documentaries have also existed outside of the Hollywood system and interpreted reality by recording actual people who might not have been appealing to studio systems. This included newsreels and travelogues in the earliest forms of film, and usually required backing from the industry or philanthropy to cover the cost, because it's not very inexpensive to make a documentary, although significantly less than to make it an epic blockbuster style film. In the 50s and 60s, there was the popularity of what was referred to as cinema verite, French for truth film. These were made possible by the emergence of portable cameras. They aimed to track reality and social interactions. Another source of film outside of the Hollywood system is independently produced films. They're usually made on much smaller budgets. They tend to show in small venues. So the emergence of things like the art house after the Paramount decision allowed for new kinds of movies, including independent films. Independent film festivals also have different distribution routes. As you can imagine, in the age of digital, we're getting even more access to different voices and different spaces. Film is much cheaper to produce now. And due to spaces like YouTube and networks of independent filmmakers that have their own channels online, it's much easier to distribute these films and have access to them as viewers and consumers. Film has a not uncomplicated relationship to the political life of the United States and its influence internationally. One aspect of this is something referred to as consensus narratives that appear in film. A consensus narrative operates across different times and cultures. Films can historically tell us a lot about the time they were produced in because they often represent what were perceived to be dominant ideas, issues, and struggles of the time. Some argue that US films contribute to the notion of the global village in which people share a universal culture, offering common media for people to connect over. But others argue that US films can stifle local culture and diversity in other countries and domestically, only privileging and paying attention to dominant voices in societies because of the ways the studio system still controls the industry and is motivated by a profit margin. This debate is important to think about in relationship to the ways you interact with movies. Movies often appeal to the idea of universal culture and make us feel more connected to a larger universal culture than to our immediate surroundings. They can often perpetuate particular narratives that reflect certain people's experiences and societies. They can paint them as universal and make them seem more dominant than they actually are. I encourage you to think about the movies you watch and what types of ideas about society those films perpetuate and what parts of society those films might ignore, hide, or construct in negative ways through their narratives. That's it for our film section. Head over to the second lecture on TV. At the end of that lecture, I will walk you through all of the homework assignments for the week. See you over there.